Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm David Skaberg, Senior Dean of the UCLA College of Letters and Science and Dean of Humanities. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Luskin Lecture for Thought Leadership, featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ayad Akhtar, one of the most creative and brilliant literary minds of our time. His novel, American Elegies, is, as this afternoon's discussion will show, a signal example of leadership through thought. The Luskin Lecture for Thought Leadership was established in 2011 as part of a transformative gift from Meyer and Rini Luskin. Their vision in establishing the lecture series gave UCLA an opportunity to share knowledge and foster dialogue among scholars, leaders in government and business, and the greater Los Angeles community. Featured speakers are selected collaboratively by the Senior Dean of the UCLA College, the Dean of the UCLA School of Law, the Dean of the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and the Dean of Social Sciences in the college. We're incredibly grateful to Meyer and Rini Luskin for establishing this important lecture series, which allows us to welcome thought leaders to engage with our campus community. Thank you to you both. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Mnookin, Dean, and Ralph and Shirley Shapiro Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law and Faculty Co-Director of Pulse at UCLA Law, the program on understanding law, science, and evidence. Dean Mnookin will introduce our speaker, Ayad Akhtar, and our moderator for today, Professor Ali Behdad.
Thank you so much, David. And I want to echo your very warm gratitude to Meyer and Rini Luskin for their generosity, for their creation of this event, for all that they do around UCLA. Thank you so much, Meyer and Rini. We're enormously grateful. It's my tremendous pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ayad Akhtar, one of the most admired and celebrated writers of our time. He's a playwright, a novelist, a screenwriter, and winner of the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Drama for his play Disgraced. He's also the author of the recent novel, Homeland Elegies, which I have to say, speaking personally, was the single most affecting and inspiring book that I read during this last pandemic year. For those of you who have not read it yet, please do. I hugely recommend it, and I envy the tremendous pleasure that awaits you as soon as you open it up or when you listen to it on audio, read by Ayad himself. Homeland Elegies is an extraordinary novel about America, about the shape of our lives, and about identity, immigrant identity, Muslim identity, professional identity, and American identity in all of its complexity. It's a beautiful interweaving of fact and fiction on topics that I'm sure we'll hear much more about today. In addition to his Pulitzer Prize, Ayad's accomplishments are many. His award-winning plays also include Junk and The Invisible Hand, and his first novel, American Dervish, has been published in more than 20 languages. In 2017, he received an Arts and Letters Award for Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Steinberg Playwright Award, and the Nestroy Theater Prize. He's also received a number of prestigious fellowships. He's the president of PEN America, the National Writers Organization, and he is a trustee at New York Theater Workshop. So it's just an enormous pleasure to have him here with us virtually at UCLA today. And I truly can't wait to hear what he has to share with us. We also have a tremendously distinguished moderator today, UCLA professor Ali Behdad, the John Charles Hills Chair in Literature, professor of English and Comparative Literature, and the director of the Center for the Near Eastern Studies here at UCLA. Ali has published widely on issues of travel, immigration, Orientalism, and post-colonialism, and he will join Ayad in conversation in a few moments, and then we'll end with some questions from our audience, including from some of the students who are with us today. In the meantime, please join me in giving a very warm and hearty UCLA welcome to Ayad Akhtar and Ali Behdad. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right. Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me. And I'm in upstate New York, where the weather for the first time is actually like it usually is in LA. So I don't feel that envious of you all, but most of the time I do. I'm going to just read briefly from the beginning of the book, Homeland Elegies, which is a novel, though the narrator has my name and many of the facts of my life, but it is actually a novel. And I'm sure that Ali and I will discuss that shortly. But I'm going to read from the opening chapter, which is called Overture to America. I had a professor in college, Mary Maroney, who taught Melville and Emerson, and who the once famous Norman O. Brown, her mentor, called the finest mind of her generation. A diminutive cherubic woman in her early 30s, with a resemblance to a Raphaelesque Puto that was not incidental. Her parents had immigrated from Urbino. A scholar of staggering erudition who quoted as easily from the Eddas and Hannah Arendt as she did from Moby Dick. A lesbian, which I only mention because she did often. A lecturer whose turns of phrase were sharp as a German paring knife, could score the brain's gray matter and carve out new grooves along which old thoughts would reroute, as on that February morning, 2 weeks after Bill Clinton's first inauguration, when, during a class on life under early American capitalism, Mary, clearly interrupted by her own tantalizing thought, looked up from the floor at which she usually gazed as she spoke, looked up and remarked, almost offhandedly, that America had begun as a colony, and that a colony it remained. That is, a place still defined by its plunder, where enrichment was paramount and civil order always an afterthought. The fatherland, in whose name and for whose benefit the predation continued, was no longer a physical fatherland, but a spiritual one, the American self. Long trained to worship its desires, however discreet, however banal, rather than question them as the classical tradition taught, ever tumescent American self-regard was the pillaging patria, she said, and the marauding years of the Reagan regime had only expressed this enduring reality of American life with greater clarity and transparency than ever before. Mary had gotten into some trouble the previous semester for similarly bracing remarks about American hegemony in the wake of Desert Storm. A student in the ROTC program taking her class complained to the administration that she was speaking out against the troops. He started a petition and set up a table in the student union. The brouhaha led to an editorial in the campus paper and threats of a protest that never actually materialized. Mary wasn't cowed. After all, this was the early 90s, and the consequences of astringent ideological fire and brimstone or sexual abuse of power while you're at it were hardly what they are today. If anyone had a problem with what she said that afternoon, I didn't hear about it. The truth is, I doubt many of us even understood what she was getting at. I certainly didn't. Worship of desire? Tumescent self-regard? A colony for pillage? In her words was the power of a great negation, a corrective to a tradition of endless American self-congratulation. It was new to me. I was accustomed to the God bless light of the world exceptionalism that informed every hour I'd ever spent in history class. I'd come of age in the era of the hilltop city gleaming for all to see. Such were the glorified tropes I learned at school, which I saw not as tropes, but as truth. I saw an American benevolence in Uncle Sam's knowing glare at the post office. Heard an American abundance in the canned laugh tracks on the sitcoms I watched every night with my mother, and felt an American security and strength as I pedaled my 10-speed Schwinn past split-level and two-story homes in the middle-class subdivision where I grew up. Of course, my father was a great fan of America back then. To him, there was no greater place in the world, nowhere you could do more, have more, be more. He couldn't get enough of it, camping in the Tetons, driving through Death Valley, riding to the top of the Arch in St. Louis before hopping a riverboat down to Louisiana to fish for bass in the bayou. He loved visiting the historic sites. We had framed our photos of trips to Monticello and Saratoga and to the house on Beale Street in Brookline where the Kennedy brothers were born. I recall a Saturday morning in Philadelphia when I was 8 and father scolding me for whining through a room, a crowded tour of rooms somehow connected with the Constitution. When it was over, we took a cab to the famous steps at the museum and he raced me to the top, letting me win in homage to Rocky Balboa. Love for America and a firm belief in its supremacy, moral and otherwise, was creed in our home, one my mother knew not to challenge, even if she didn't quite share it. Like both Mary's parents, as I would later learn from Mary herself, my mother never found in the various bounties of her new country anything like sufficient compensation for the loss of what she'd left behind. I don't think mother ever felt at home here. She thought Americans materialistic and couldn't understand what was so holy about the orgy of acquisition they called Christmas. She was put off that everyone always asked where she was from and never seemed bothered that they had no idea what she was talking about when she told them. Americans, to her, were ignorant not only of geography, but history too. And most troubling was what she thought connected to this disregard of important things. namely the American denial of aging and death. This last irritation would yield a malevolent concretion over the years, a terror-inducing bête noire that saw her to her grave, the thought that growing old here would mean her eventual sequestering and expiration in a home that was nothing like one. My mother's views, however rarely voiced, should have prepared me to understand Mary's dyspeptic take on this country, but they didn't. Not even my Islam prepared me to see what Mary saw, not even after 9/11. I remember a letter from her in the months following that terrifying day in September that changed Muslim lives in America forever, a 10-page missive in which she encouraged me to take heart, to learn what I could from the trouble ahead, confiding that her struggles as a gay woman in this country, the sense of siege, the unceasing assaults on her quest for wholeness, the roughness of her route to autonomy and authenticity, that all this had been but fire beneath her crucible, provoking creative rage, tempering sentimentality, releasing her from hope in ideology. Use the difficulty, make it your own, was her admonition. Difficulty had been the flintstone against which her powers of analysis were sharpened, the how and why of what she saw, but which I still wouldn't see truly with my own eyes for 15 years to come, my deepening travails as a Muslim in this country notwithstanding. No, I wouldn't see what Mary saw until I'd been witness to the untimely decline of a generation of colleagues exhausted by the demands of jobs that never paid them enough, drowning in debt to care for children riddled with disorders that couldn't be cured, and the cousins and the best friend from high school who ended up in shelters or on the street, tossed out of houses they could no longer afford, and until the near dozen suicides and overdoses of 40-something childhood classmates in a mere space of 3 years, and the friends and family medicated for despair, anxiety, lack of affect, insomnia, sexual dysfunction, and the premature cancers brought on by the chemical shortcuts for everything from the food moving through our irritable bowels to the lotions applied to our sun-poisoned skins. I wouldn't see it until our private lives had consumed the public space, then been codified, foreclosed, and put up for auction, until the devices that enslave our minds with the toxic flotsam of a culture no longer worthy of the name, until the bright pliancy of human sentience, attention itself, had become the world's most prized commodity, the very movements of our minds transformed into streams of unceasing revenue for someone, somewhere. I wouldn't see it clearly until the American self had fully mastered the plunder, idealized and legislated the splitting of the spoils, and brought to near completion the wholesale pillage, not only of the so-called colony, how provincial a locution that seems now, but also of the very world itself. In short, I wouldn't see what Mary saw back then until I'd failed at trying to see it otherwise, until I'd ceased believing in the lie of my own redemption, until the suffering of others aroused in me a starker, clearer cry than any anthem to my own longing. I read Whitman first with Mary. I adored him. The green leaves and dry leaves and spears of summer grass, the side curved head ever avid for what came next. My tongue too is homegrown. Every atom of this blood formed of this soil, this air, but these multitudes will not be my own, and these will be no songs of celebration. That's the overture. That's how the book begins, basically. I think Ali is going to join us.
Thank you very much, Ayad, for that reading. What a beautiful reading, and so so wonderful. I have a lot of questions, and I think also questions from the audience. But let me start with a general question, since this lecture is part of the Luskin series on thought leadership. I myself, and I think to some extent you, I think I'm a little bit older than you, came of intellectual age during an era dominated by post-structuralists whose theories like Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault sort of announced the death of the author, right? Barthes, for example, provocatively remarked in 1967 that the birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author. And yet, when I read your work, I cannot help by being reminded of your authorial presence on every page, not your absence. I mean, you're not only the author, you're not that kind of author that Bach talked about. It's like this figure diminishing like a tiny figure at the far end of a literary stage, right? So can you start talking a little bit about the role of authorship as you see it today for yourself in the context of your work and literature, but also as a public intellectual, right? As a thought leader. I mean, I treat you as a thought leader at this point. Right. I should mention right before I finish is that one of the students actually asked the same thing and says, how's thought leadership different from other forms of leadership? Just to throw in the student's question as well.
Interesting. Thank you for their question, and thank you for joining me here, Ali. You know, it's a good question. I think that there's a way of reading the book that actually confirms Barth's proposition that the author is dead. I mean, you know, the narrator has many of the facts of my life and he has my name, but I'm calling it a novel. And when I did the legal review at Little Brown with the publisher, you know, the lawyer was very, very concerned. Almost from page one, we had to work through it systematically. She was so concerned about lawsuits everywhere. But it turned out that when we got to the end of the legal review, she was very relieved. She said, wow, so much of this is made up. So the author is a fiction in the book, although the fiction in the book is presenting itself as a nonfiction. And the reason for that is not just to be cute and clever and all of that. It's to respond to the degradation of our relationship, both to truth, but also to deep thinking. Something about our relationship to the devices and to discourse, whether it's on Twitter or in all of its various sort of abbreviated form, that mirrors advertising, really. It doesn't mirror critical thought. Our cognitive abilities are being transformed by the platforms, and our ability to countenance contradiction, to sit and to sustain concentration, to be able to follow the nuances of a deeper thought are being compromised. And so how to marshal language in service of deeper thinking today? To me, it felt like I had to make some sort of a concession to the cognitive impairment that the devices have created. And so one of the things that I decided to do was to take a page out of Instagram and to stage the self. I mean, what is the theme of Instagram par excellence? What's the theme of so much social media and so much contemporary identity and experience today is me. What's my experience? What do people need to know about what I think? Who am I? What's my story? What are people going to think about what I want? And, you know, without casting sort of aspersions or moral judgments about this basically orientation, this kind of socialized narcissism that we have created, and that is the fundament of our society now, using the terms of that staging of the self to ensnare the reader and draw them in to a conference about America. What has happened to our country? Why are these things happening? How could we have a charlatan and moron as our president for 4 years? I mean, irrespective of his politics, just the fact that he was such an idiot is an offense. How did that happen? Well, he played a CEO on television for 14 years. And it turns out that actually matters more to folks than substance. How? Why? What is that all about? So that was the procedure of approaching it that way. As far as thought leadership goes, to me, I wanted to convene, as I said earlier, a conference with the reader, with all of my fellow Americans. And I thought maybe I could summon a language that would bring us together for the space of the pages of the book, irrespective of our experience or our identities or our politics. And we could reflect meaningfully on what has come of the American dream.
Thanks so much. That's very interesting. I mean, you know, I was reminded as you were speaking of Edward Said, who appears in some form in your novel, and his words that, you know, our critical sense has been anesthetized in the United States sometime. And I love that you actually kind of, in a way, force us to really become a critical thinker as we read your novel. Now, let's go back toward the end of the Homeland Elegies, now that you brought this issue up. There is a scene where this is your mentor, Mary Maroney's class, where the students are discussing Whitman's democratic vistas, right?
Yeah, right.
And his concern about the nation's preoccupation with the business of making money, which you just brought up, and she thinks that it would lead to the failure of his historic political mission. Now, in the scene, the narrator talks about America's remunerative individualism and says how Mary still believes that art would play a kind of an essential role or essential part in countering it. Now, the narrator seems initially convinced by her argument, but later in the episode, he confesses that he's actually dour on that idea because America has always evinced deep strains of anti-intellectualism. And by the way, I should say here, just as Whitman was writing his poetry, Tocqueville, right, spoke about America's deep anti-intellectualism when he visited the young nation. Now, I bring this up because I want to know, what do you think about the role of literature and art with regard to social change? I mean, you talked about it a little bit. Can art and literature really counter undemocratic tendencies in our society? Are you hopeful like Mary, or are you pessimistic like your narrator at the end?
It's a good question. I don't know. I waver on that. You know, I recognize that we are in a country where, and I quote Emerson in the book, in 1834, I believe it was, or 1837, Emerson wrote in his journal, you know, why can't a man sit down to think in this country without somebody asking if he's got a headache? And when you're confronted by the great expanse of land and trees that need to be cleared and stones that need to be pulled from the fields, and for whatever it's worth, good or bad, you know, the illusion of manifest destiny that inspires the march across the country and to tame, if you will, for agricultural purposes, this extraordinary expanse of continent. What does thought have to do with that? What do words have to do with that? What do poems have to do with that? They don't have anything to do with that. They're a diversion. They're something to keep you going, if you will, a kind of a nourishment that reminds you of what's beautiful about life or what's profound about life. But it isn't the stuff of making the society. And I think that dichotomy is writ large in American culture. And you know, it's not for nothing that much older cultures, you know, whether they're Far Eastern cultures or European cultures, where there is a long aristocratic tradition, a lot of people of influence who have a lot of free time, where literary traditions have really been born and flourished. And so, you know, does literature move the needle in the United States? I don't know. I mean, I don't think it does, not the way that technological innovation does. I don't think you can find a writer maybe who's competed with Henry Ford in terms of his impact or his or her impact on the psyche of the nation. You know, when Percy Shelley says poets and philosophers are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, he may be right, but what he means in our era is those self-styled creators of content and lifestyle, the Kardashians, Beyonce and Jay-Z, the Trumps, these self-promoting narrative artists who are selling a vision of life and of their own lives in order to make money. That's the American way. The expression of personal will par excellence in American life has always been the accumulation of wealth. End of story. And that's the story of Homeland Elegies, in a way, is an artist coming to understand that money is what has made America. It's what's made America strong. It's what made America so desired across the planet. We seem to think it's about the ideas. There are a lot of countries that have ideas. We weren't even the first country to abolish slavery. So why do we get the credit for moral high ground here? We don't. We get the credit because we've made a really, really great pitch to the world for many generations that this is a special place, but that pitch was based on having the money to do it. Mm-hmm. That's the nature of soft power. So,
yeah. And of course, you know, one of the things which I was, as you were saying, also wealth enables the possibility of having a certain form of art. You know, often literature, for example, flourishes during a time of prosperity, economic prosperity, you know. But the other thing that you were saying, which is also interesting, is that I mean, someone like you who actually produces plays, and we were talking earlier that there will be even maybe certain visual or filmic representations that you will be doing. In some ways, I feel like there you have a bigger audience, right? I mean, I think that in terms of literature, yes, not many people read these days, but in film, in theater, I think you have a broader audience, right?
Yes, it's for certain, but it's that great distinction that Socrates makes between flattering the public and giving the public something that they really need, but they may not want.
Mm-hmm.
And that distinction is essential here. And so when you're involved in the creation of audiovisual media and the amount of money that's required to create those works, millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, certainly with television at this point, even high prestige television a show will cost $100 million to a network. There's a premium on making sure that is not too complicated, that it's not too complex, that it's not too controversial. It must not be. It has to mirror certain moral platitudes. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the audience will reject it. Mm-hmm. And if the audience rejects it, there is a financial outlay that is going to lead to folks losing their jobs, right, which is very different than an individual artist who, for whatever reason, crazy or not, or inspired or wishing to speak truth to power, will endeavor to find a form and a shape and a language to do so, and then suffer the consequences individually. You can't ask a corporation to build a business model on suffering the consequences of speaking the truth to power. That doesn't exist.
And that's what's so courageous about your writing. I feel like you bring up a lot of political issues. We'll get to that in just a second, but no, that's very interesting. I mean, just let me continue on with this line of thinking. In the epigraph, right, to Homeland Elegies is by Alison Bechdel, where the quotation is, "I can only make things up about things that have already happened. I can only make things up about things that have already happened." Now, your novel clearly plays on the currently popular genre of memoir, right? When I started reading it, I mean, I had to like check back on the front page to make sure I was reading a novel, not a memoir. It forced me to think in those terms. Can you say more about the relationship between the sort of the autobiographical discourse and novelistic discourse in your work in general? Because I feel even your first novel is very autobiographical, right? Growing up in Wisconsin. I can ask the question in different ways. Like, what is gained or lost, for that matter, when we fictionalize certain facts or blend facts and fiction, as you do, right, in an age marked by fake news?
Yeah.
Right.
Look, it's a great question. It's a great question, and it implies a moral. There's a moral presupposition there that somehow the artist should be doing something that's morally acceptable, right? Which I don't agree with. I think that art has its own rules, and that the rules by which art works or doesn't work has very little to do with its intentionality. It has more to do with its effect. I'm a formalist in that regard. I believe that form has an effect on attention and on the way that language is processed by the brain. And so I want to have a certain relationship with my reader. I want that relationship to be intimate. I want that reader to not think, oh, this is not really real, because there's a different ontology and a different epistemology at work. There's a different sense of what's at stake when you read something that you think might be real, which is why fake news works. I mean, which is why people believe these things and then suddenly they act on them in the real world. And so playing with that modality, which is the modality of our time, I think it's not a coincidence that this is happening. This is part of a much deeper philosophical shift, in the civilizational shift, philosophically speaking, that we're dealing with this erosion or this decay of any notion of truth or process of getting to a consensus around truth. And so as an artist, I wanted to reflect that, the texture of that. I didn't want to litigate it. It's up to the reader to litigate that. It's not up to me. What I wanted to do was to create a trompe-l'oeil, if you will, the French tradition of an illusion, a painting that you almost think, wait, is that real? Can I walk through that? That was the goal. And there was a reason for it that was connected to our politics today.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think what you're saying, rephrase it in this way, that kind of in an age of alternative facts, you know, as Kellyanne Conway sort of coined that term, what you're saying is that in fact, fiction can be more powerful as a public or political discourse in this kind of a Trump and post-Trump era, right?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. And in a way, what I'm trying to do, if we look at it from a historical perspective, I'm trying to reclaim lyric language as having a political centrality for people's experience. Because, you know, now it's relegated to, you know, pastime. We read a good book because I want to read a good book and it's going to be fun, or maybe I'll learn something. And it's not a public act. It's not something that matters in any significant public way. And have no illusion that I've written a book that is going to make people think that it does. But I wanted to write a book that was going to exist as if it were, even if it couldn't be, as if it were, as if there were a language that could summon us all together to think and feel deeply about who we are, what we have allowed to happen, how wealth has completely transformed our country.
Very Whitman-esque, I should say, you know.
Yeah, no, that's why it begins with Whitman.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that was very clear. Let's talk politics.
Okay.
Not that we haven't talked already. And I don't mean Trump here. You know, the title of your novel, right, Homeland Elegies, suggests a particular take on your part, at least as an author, about the US as homeland, right? Homeland Elegies.
Right.
More generally, I think about the world, right? In that it contextualizes the novel and the action in terms of an elegy, right? Now, as a professor of literature, I'm well aware of all, you know, the fact that the genre of elegy has been subjected to all kinds of debate, and it's kind of a vague term and so on and so forth. Still, I think elegy does bring into mind a meditative form of poetic lamentation.
Sure.
Lamenting the death of a loved one and the broader theme of mortality, which is also part of your novel, of course. I mean, the German poet Rilke, you know, says that sort of elegy deals with the poet's search for spiritual values in an alien universe, which I feel is also true in that way. In that way, your work is very elegiac. Am I correct in thinking that you are mourning the loss of an ideal or idealized homeland, Pakistan for the father of the narrator, and the US in some sense for the narrator of the novel, or an ideal form of it? Could you talk a little bit about this elegy and your sense of loss and lamenting? What are you lamenting?
Beautiful. Thank you for that question. My folks came here in '68. My mom passed away in 2017. My dad passed away in 2019, as I was writing this book, actually. And they were here 50 years, half century, almost to the year. And in that half century, America changed a lot. And the story, I started to see that the story of how America had changed, the country that they thought they were coming to, and which maybe on some level they were, and the country that it became, was mirrored in their lives. And it was mirrored in their fates, and mirrored in the fates of those like them who had come over at the same time, many of their friends and colleagues, fellow doctors, and the kids that they'd had, like myself, and what had become of us, and how we had chosen to make our lives. All of that told a very rich story about this half century of American life and the transformations. Ultimately, I really do believe, and at the root, they have to do with money, and how money has transformed this country in the past half century, how it transformed my parents' lives, how it transformed the narrator's life, my life, if you will. All of that, to me, was a story of loss. It was a story of a lost moral capital. It was a story of a lost collective vision. It was a story of gain only to the individual. We lost to I. And so the elegy is really singing for the loss of a collective American soul, if you will, that we've become so atomized. And we've become atomized because it has served the power of money, ultimately. That's the argument.
And it also, in some ways, about our identity, or at least the narrator's identity in this regard, and our identity. I was thinking, as you were talking about the end of how the novel ends with the scene where this older white man stands up at a lecture that the narrator has given about Muslim world, and the narrator had been critical of the US policies with regard to at least Muslim communities. And at the end of the lecture, this guy stands up, this older white man stands up and confronts the narrator saying, if you don't like it here, why don't you just leave, right?
Right.
So, I mean, so it involves also a certain kind of a shift in the way America has become with regard to this. But can you talk a little bit about the possibilities and limitations of political or cultural critique that we're making with this regard? Because I think your novel is very much into that, especially for Muslims and non-white intellectuals. I mean, what are our possibilities and the limitation for this kind of a critique, this kind of a political or cultural critique?
So the novel is kind of a bit of false advertising in a way, because the novel presents itself as a meditation on the dilemmas of being an outsider in America, being an American, but being an outsider in America. But in fact, the novel is really about what has happened to America, not what has happened to the outsiders in America. And that's a dramaturgical sleight of hand that I've done to keep the reader focused here, while the real argument of the book is proceeding on almost a more emotional, sometimes subconscious level. And so the vision of a country hollowed out by ideology related to money, by the legislation of individual wealth, by the shifting of our philosophical bedrock that made it acceptable, even celebrated, for us to sell off our national infrastructure. That somehow the idea that it was acceptable and celebrated that you figure out a way to gut industries that keep the country alive to line your own pocket. And that at the end of the day, what that leads to is you making enough money to present yourself as somehow morally better than others, like Trump seemed to somehow make a case for, that he was more independent, or that he had the freedom to tell the truth, and he was more committed to the things that mattered because he had the money to do that. That money is the great legitimizer of political will. It is all of that. That's the argument of the book, which has nothing to do with identity, because I think that identity is a distraction. I think it's not really what's at stake in our country. Those are things that certainly matter. The representation matters, opportunity matters, but it's not actually what is happening to the country. It's not what's happening to the world if we want to take it a step further. We're living, I believe, that we're living in an era of corporate autocracy. We are living in a corporate totalitarian order where the decision-making about the most essential things in our lives are dictating policy at a level, there's a body of thought leadership, if you will, that is not beholden to the public. There is no franchise that the public, worldwide or the United States, can engage in that is going to assert its will somehow to that body of thought leadership. And that really, to me, is the fundamental issue. And until we can figure out how to deal with that, we are not going to be able to handle what's coming our way, whether it's climate change or whether it's mass migration or the erosion of what we're seeing, this sort of collective agreements in our societies, that it's going to lead to bloodshed.
Very nice, interesting. One thing though, I mean, let's sort of talk about America, right? I mean, and the issue of immigration, right, which is part of at least sort of thematic debates, not only this work but in other work as well. Now, in my one of my books, A Forgetful Nation, I argue that America has an ambivalent relationship with its immigrants. It vacillates between xenophilia and xenophobia, a kind of a love and hate relationship, right? And this is something that can be traced back to the founding fathers debate between Jefferson and Hamilton about the question of immigration. The narrator of the narrator's father in Homeland for Me, in some ways, exemplifies this typical forgetful American who, in some self-hating fashion, embraces the anti-immigrant discourse of Trump and other activists, at least in part of the novel.
Right.
Now, the kind of forgetfulness, as I said, has a long history. I mean, one interesting figure is Dennis Kearney, the California labor leader and an Irish immigrant, right, who spearheaded the anti-Chinese racist movement that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act at the late 19th century. Now, one can argue that from its very genesis, then a great deal of forgetfulness has been a part of it. I mean, we were told by John Quincy Adams that Europeans must shed their European skin, right? And Crevecoeur, the first American writer, he says he's an American who leaves behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced. Now, the narrator is clearly on the side of racism, quite critical of any form of racism. But can you talk a little bit about the personal and political tension between the narrator and father? Because after all, one can read the novel also as a kind of a family story, right?
Totally, yeah.
And a father-son drama. So that's what I'm asking. How do you see this sort of this relationship? And if you want, you can also talk a little bit about viability of multiculturalism as a discourse, given what you just said in terms of capitalism and America's, but also in terms of America's vexed understanding of its cultural identity.
What's interesting, again, the notion of identity to me is a secondary one. I think that if we look at what has happened to America over the last 50 years, say, right? Mm-hmm. We see that eroding moral capital. What is the deeper through line of that? To me, it's about a collective, it's the idea of a collective strength. And there's been a thievery, really, of that collective, the resources of that and the sources of that collective strength from that pool of shared resources in some form or other, whether it's through labor unions or whatever it may be, to the individual. Mm-hmm. That's the movement that is. And we may find that that's not going to be sustainable. I mean, as Henry Ford once said, and love him or hate him, a lot of reasons to hate him, but he once said, I think very, very accurately and presciently, that if you can't pay your workers enough to buy the cars that they're making, you're going to have a long-term structural problem. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We are 50 years into a long-term structural problem. Yep. Identity does not compete with that problem. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Identity is an easier thing for us to focus on because there is moral value to it. And it's something that has been promulgated in the academe as an analysis for our problems, but I actually don't think it is our problem. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that, we're going to continue to evolve and be imperfect and continue to try to move the needle of justice. But moving that needle is not going to solve this deeper problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you look at the erosion and the corrosion of the Roman Republic, this is what happened. Mm-hmm. It was all the power being arrogated to the aristocratic class. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's what eroded the health of the Roman Republic.
Yes.
We're in the same situation.
That's so interesting because I mean, one of the actually some of the I know when you talk about how the dominance of sort of identity politics in America in academia has also blinded us to all kinds of things. There are other ones who I think would agree with you. I mean, one famous critic who says, you know, in America we talk about identity and race because we don't want to talk about class and economics in some ways. You know, that there is in fact, you know, we've taken capitalism for granted. We don't ever question anything to that.
What's fascinating about it, I spent a few years doing a deep dive on discourse around socialism and capitalism years ago, and you know, it was fascinating to recognize that in the 1840s, during the era of the rise of workers' movements in Europe, that there was at that time a concerted effort on the part of propertied classes, those who owned, nobility and others, to articulate a platform and an agenda to delegitimize any notion of collective responsibility or collective ownership or anything like that. And that platform is virtually unchanged to the locutions from 1848. It is the same stuff that gets repeated about socialism and whatnot, and all of these critiques, which they're not meaningful because they're not critically informed. There is certainly an argument to be made that entrepreneurship is an important engine of national vitality and that the animal spirits of the market do provide a much needed injection of vitality into our collective life. There's a good argument to be made, but it has nothing to do with all of this nonsense that has been repeated since the 1840s by the moneyed classes. So that lack of critical thinking about this central issue in our republic has led to, you know, the Milton Friedmans and you know, et cetera, about 50 years ago, whose, you know, triumph in the arena of public discourse means that, to quote something you said earlier, is that it's easier to talk about race and identity in academia than economics and class. It's not that it's easier, it's that talking about class and economics doesn't matter anymore. They won. It doesn't matter. We've got to go get money from them just to have a conversation. Right. If we don't have access to the funds that they give us, there's no meaningful conversation, that we don't even have jobs. So much better to talk about something where we can actually move the needle than to focus on more where we can't. And that to me is a measure of the despair of our national discourse and the impoverishment of our analysis of the problem. And antitrust is a case in point. How did we get from a country where we would litigate 8% market share to a country where Amazon can destroy brick and retail mortar and be celebrated as an innovator? How did that happen? 86 cents of every dollar spent at a big box Walmart leaves that community, most of it going to Arkansas and then to offshore accounts.
Right.
By most estimations, we're somewhere north of $10 trillion that are in bank accounts that are never going to come back into the system, ever. People worry about real estate prices. Why are real estate prices so high? They're going to continue to rise because folks with money, and those mountains of money need a place to be placed and earn 5%. Money is determining our way of life in ways that we don't even understand. And university is just another case in point, which we can talk about, but I've gone on for a while, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you. No, those are great points. Let me ask you a question from students. One of them was asking about that when it comes to stories, what do you think people look for in stories? Ergo, what is it that writers should always keep in mind while writing something? And what do you think young and new writers like the student should explore? Any words of wisdom for them?
You know, I've come to feel over the years that audiences are most engaged when they know when they're watching a character who wants something. And the clearer and more defined that desire, and the more impeded the progress of that character's march toward getting what he or she or they want, the more engaging the story. And that's the very basic geometry of storytelling, has to do with desire. And I think in that respect is a profound meditation on human life. That narrative really does reflect that centrality, to use the Heideggerian term, of care in our lives. What we care about, what we want, what we feel when we want and when we don't get what we want, or when we try to get what we want. That's the central agon of human existence. And that's when narrative, to me, is most effective. The best stories tend to make that clear pretty soon, and they tend to keep the verdict is out, the jury is out, and we don't know if the character is going to get what they want for a long time in the best stories.
Right.
So,
the characters take their life of their own, so they become like people. Another former students and now currently at UCLA staff is asking kind of an interesting question also about your dream life, right? Your dream life is very important to you, and sometimes you perceive your dreams as premonitions in the novel. Have you had any dreams recently that seem like premonitions and that you would like to share with us?
Thank you for that question. Certainly the narrator in the book has had some premonitory dreams, and I have too, I mean, in all frankness. You know, I think just the most significant premonitory dream that I had of late was the pandemic. Before, maybe 6 weeks before the pandemic, I had a dream that there was a malign fog that was starting to descend upon this mountain in this area that I was at, and I started to run away and realized there was nowhere to go because the fog was starting to engulf the world. So, you know, go figure. I wake up from the dream, I have no idea what it's all about. And then, you know, all of a sudden, a few weeks later, a month and a half later, we're in a pandemic. So.
Right. No, that's great. Let me we only have, I think, probably one last question. I'm personally curious about your relationship with Salman Rushdie. Like, there's a great scene with your aunt, with the narrator, Aunt Asma, about Rushdie's work. She finds Midnight Children brilliant, but when the narrator says that he's been reading Rushdie's Satanic Verses, in which the narrator sees that he actually has encountered so much of himself on every page of that novel, your aunt starts berating Rushdie and says this sickening ad hominem attack on the prophet, picking through that disgusting Orientalist history, disgusting tales that Christian told me about the prophet. Can you share with us, you mentioned that Rushdie very much read the novel and found it very painful. Could you finish that?
So Salman, I've known, I know Salman somewhat. I mean, he's not a very close friend, but he's somebody that I've known also through PEN America. He was a former president of PEN America, and I'm the current president. So we've had some, interaction, and it's always been very warm. He came to Disgraced when it was up at Lincoln Center, and he was very encouraging. And I, sort of floored that Salman Rushdie had come and seen my work and all of that. So I sent him the book when I finished it, and I was hoping that he would read it, and maybe if he was generous enough, that he would write something nice that we could put on the cover. And of course he did. He wrote a brilliant blurb for the book that has really helped. But it was interesting because when I got an email from him that he had read it, he wrote me the blurb, and then he wrote a separate email in which was just private, where I don't think he would have a problem with me talking about it here, but he didn't want it on the cover of the book. Was that the book had actually been a painful book for him to read, and not because of all of the sort of attacks that my aunt in the book, wages, all of the things she says about him, but because, it was a reality that I was writing about a reality that he knew so well, but that it had turned its back on him. And so he had to turn his back on it. And in a way, that's the journey also of the narrator, that the homeland, the elegies of the homeland, it's an elegy to the loss of the homeland of his parents, which is part of his own experience and part of his own understanding of who he is. But when his parents die, that he realizes, well, he's American. That's all he is American in this America that he's not sure how he feels about, and that is certainly not sure how it feels about him.
Thank you very much. That was an incredibly wonderful presentation and conversation. Very much enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, Ali. And thank you to you all at UCLA. It has been a pleasure.
I think our dean will be closing. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for this extraordinary discussion and this extraordinary consideration of such a wide range of issues. Ayad, thank you for your novel, for the depth and critical sharpness of your reflection, and for your leadership as a thinker. Ayad and Ali, thank you both for this lively and utterly serious discussion, so thoroughly steeped in the history of American literature and culture, and for what you've helped us to see about our national moment. Maya and Rini, thank you for making the Luskin Thought Leadership Lectures possible, and for being constant friends to UCLA as a place of inquiry and discovery. To our whole audience today, I thank you all for listening, for questioning, and for thinking with UCLA.